Hello to all you fine, amazing people out there listening. A very warm welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show. I am extremely thrilled to introduce my guest today, Professor of Music, Poundie Burstein. He is a professor at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and he is here today to talk to me about his excellent new book, which has been getting rave reviews, Journeys Through Galant Expositions. Professor Burstein, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Welcome, Nikhil.
Before we begin, could you please take a few minutes to tell me about your musical background and how you came to write this book, which I believe constituted, an amazing 15 years of planning and research?
Yes. Well, I'll move back a little bit in time. When I was young, a child, I heard the album A Love Supreme by John Coltrane.
Right.
And I was extremely moved. I never experienced music moving me so deeply. And I decided to devote myself to music at that time. I became a jazz fan. I played saxophone, tenor sax, after my hero, John Coltrane. And I studied that for many years. And then after a while, I also became curious about classical music, which I had not yet quite liked. But in my mid-teens, I decided to give classical music a try as well. My mother's a nursery school teacher, and she had a kiddie record of short classical pieces, including a gavotte by Bach, J.S. Bach. And I said, let me listen to this, see if I could like it. I listened to it twice. I couldn't make sense out of it. I said, I'll give it one more shot, and that's it. And I listened to this Bach piece for the third time, and the third time it hit me, and I was just bowled over. And every day after school, I would listen to this gavotte over and over again for about an hour. I just couldn't believe how great it was. And then I became interested in both classical and jazz music, though eventually just I can't focus on everything. I focused on classical music. But my inspiration about studying form came from that time as a young teenager, when I listened to this Bach piece and I knew, and I sensed that what I caught the third time listening to it, that I missed the first couple of times, was that its power relied something on its form. That is, that sections seemed to come back, and that moments in the piece reacted to other moments, so that every little moment of the piece seemed to bear the emotional weight of the entire piece. And this is basically what I've been devoting my life to ever since. But it's the emotional reaction, and I eventually became a music theorist, and I taught at various schools, and I taught form, and I found the tools that people have introduced to discuss form to be very helpful in many ways, whereby we have a series of labels and metaphors and analogs to describe form, whereby you have a thematic container that relates to another thematic container, and there are subcontainers within each thematic container, and if you relate these to one another, you can it can open up much of the piece to you. But every metaphor, of course, has a problem, because they're always inexact, and they come with both advantages and disadvantages. And this is and like many people, when I try to apply the standard metaphors to music of Joseph Haydn, who's a composer I grew to love, I realized they didn't quite work, and then something was odd. And the typical way people describe this is they say, well, Joseph Haydn, he's a little quirky, his forms are quirky.
Right.
But of course, I realized that you have to understand his music is quirky, but not often for the reasons that people mention. And an example that really hit me, and this is what started me off on this project about 15 years ago, people would talk about this thing called the false recapitulation. That's when you have one of the situations of a so-called false recapitulation is when the main theme arrives in the tonic key in the middle of the development section, because the development section is supposed to be the container that contains the restless, energetic, developmental type material. So if the main theme comes in the tonic key, in the middle of the development, that is supposed to be funny or witty or odd. But it never sounded odd to me. And then people would say, well, if you understood music like the people at the time did, you would appreciate this. But then I read what the people at the time said, and they said the exact opposite of what modern people said. We think that there's a container containing the development section. We think it's a real thing. It's not. It's a metaphor that works a lot of times, but often doesn't. And I was very much inspired by writings of Peter Hoyt in this regard, and I realized there's other ways of thinking about the so-called false recapitulation that I found richer, using different metaphors and analogs to describe this situation, and that's more in tune with what the people at the time said, and this was the outgrowth of other investigations into the form of the Galant era, that is up until around 1780, that type of music, and that ultimately gave birth to the book Journeys Through Galant Expositions.
Can I take a step back and talk about form itself and the study of form? And I noticed one thing you were writing about in the book, which is that the study of form in the 18th century, it did not have that level of emphasis, at least in the first half of the 18th century anyway.
I don't know if it's not as serious, but it had a different angle. And the theorists I focus on are more in the second half, to be sure. They were trying to describe, not for the purpose of analyzing music, but for the down-to-earth practice of composing music and improvising music. So they wrote in relationship to what someone could compose for would-be composers, and it had a practical bent, and they avoided abstractions, and they would constantly remind you that they're teaching you mechanical rules to sort of get you started, but ultimately music, there's other things that underlie what makes great music.
When was that shift to a more greater focus on form, at least people writing about form?
I think this happened in the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century. You might have to ask other people who are more experts in this area. But people started to, as far as writing for non-composers, people talked about, they wrote for composers during the 18th century. Writing for non-composers, I think, developed during the 19th century as a means of enculturating audiences into understanding forms of people like Beethoven. To give like an example, when Beethoven's late quartets were first performed, they were performed twice. This is in the premiere, because it was thought that, well, people will have a little trouble understanding this work unless you heard it twice.
Wow.
So you can really get it. People didn't think back then. They didn't. It's like today you'd say, well, a chef is cooking a meal, and say, well, you have to eat this twice because the first time you say, no, let's cook the meal that I like. People in the 18th century, they composed pieces, it's not that the audiences had to be encultured to learn this, to like this music. It was supposed to entertain people. So the notion that you had to study to learn how to appreciate the music was, I think, more of a 19th century.
Poundie, when you were talking about forms, are we referring to all compositions, opera, instrumental, symphonies, chamber work, solo keyboard?
I believe so, though what I focus on, to be sure, in my book is on instrumental forms. That's enough. I mean, there's a lot. Forms are very complicated. Music's very complicated. I decided to just focus on galant music and instrumental music primarily.
And within instrumental music, that encapsulates concertos, solo works, chamber works, and that sort of thing? And do you find that there's a lot of variance among those categories? For example, is the form of just a sonata, for instance, a keyboard sonata versus a chamber work, would you notice great similarities just because they're instrumental, or would you notice that, because of the nature of the composition, the form is going to be radically different? They're
going to have a great deal of similarities. The instrumental type will inevitably color the form itself. For instance, in later 18th century music, if you have a sonata for violin and piano, and the piano starts off with the melody, well, then the violin has to have the melody, or vice versa. It's just, there are things that are going to happen because of the nature of the ensemble itself. Whereas in a piano work, you don't necessarily have to have that. Every part has to have its shot.
You mentioned Hoyt. Were there other people who influenced you in your understanding of form that were significant?
The main people that influenced me were Peter Hoyt's a modern scholar, and then many other excellent modern scholars: Danuta Mirka, Vasily Biros, Marcus Neuwirth, Felix Diergarten, Wolfgang Budai, Elaine Sisman, many excellent scholars, including some people who focus on later music: James Webster, James Herbert Koskin, Warren Darcy, William Kaplan. They've all influenced me. But as far as galant music, the people who've most greatly influenced me are the people from the 18th century, such as Heinrich Christoph Koch, Josef Riepel, as well as Francesco Galeazzi and Neubauer.
What made you decide on particularly the Galant period?
It was just what I was focusing on. I realized that there were gaps in what people were discussing. I happened to be very inspired by this style of music, and once I start to, you might say, pull a thread, I noticed there was a loose thread, so to speak, as I mentioned earlier with the false recapitulation. And as soon as I started pulling on that thread and said, what else are there problems involved in discussing music of this era, I started to find there were many problems, not just as far as the development and recapitulation were concerned, but as far as the exposition was concerned. And the more I searched and explored, the more I realized that there were problems that had developed in the standard understandings of this type of music.
One of the main subjects of your book, you reference Heinrich Christoph Koch a lot. But before that, he was influenced by another 18th century theorist, Joseph Riepel, who is a name that I think would be familiar to those who have read, for instance, Robert Yurdigan's music in the Galant style, because he popularized those schemata like the Fonte, the Monte, and the Ponte. Let's talk a little bit about Riepel for a minute. Who is he? Why is he significant with regard to the study of form? Let's get into it.
Okay. Joseph Riepel was a composer who wrote a series of books on dealing with a number of topics, including form. But it's basically methods of composition. The books was written in a series of volumes, a series of chapters, each of which consisted of a separate volume, and most of these volumes were written in the style of a dialogue. He, between a teacher and a student, and they would work out various issues that, among other things, deal with what we today would understand as form. How do you shape a larger composition? For instance, in the second volume, and by the way, it's written as a dialogue between a teacher and a student, and the teacher's sort of a goofball, and he makes a lot of sarcastic asides and jokes. And the student doesn't always agree with the teacher. Sometimes he argues back. And many times you hear the discussion, you leave off saying, well, what, like the teacher will say, here's an example, and the student says, well, I heard something the other day that I sort of liked, and the teacher will say, well, I don't know if that quite worked. And then you wish, being a 21st century person, you say, Joseph Riepel, can you just say, is this good or bad? But music doesn't work that way. And I think that was his method, to sort of, not to give definitive answers, but to sort of explore what are the possibilities, of which sometimes the student has the correct answer. It's not always so clear, either in his book or in real music. But in any case, in the second lesson, the student greets the teacher. He says, greetings and good morning, salutations. And then he says this very, very long word. He says, I can't say the word. It goes on forever. And he says, "Oh, good, but let's just get right down to business." Okay. And of course, in the student greeting the teacher by saying he wants to get down to business, he says this long word. He does the exact opposite. And this is part of Riepel's jokes. And then the teacher says, "Oh, that word you just mentioned, it sounds like something I would read in a mathematical treatise." And people hate mathematical treatises. So, because he hates mathematical treatises, he likes down-to-earth ways of approaching music.
Okay.
And then later on in the lesson, he says, "I'm going to address that third word." But I think he means by this is that very, very long word just goes on without articulation, without clarification. And how, if you're creating a type of music, how do you organize it? How do you articulate it along the way?
Okay.
And just in that word sort of has no articulation. It's impossible to even know what it is. That did not have articulation, just like a poor piece of music. But a good piece of music, there will be ways of understanding it through moving towards moments of articulation. This is one of the things that Riepel addressed in his book.
Did his work have any influence on composers of the 18th century? Are there any significant ones who appeared to use his writings?
Oh yes, there are. There were people who explicitly said, I forget, one of his students said that they were influenced by Riepel, and they mentioned other composers of the time, such as Holzbauer, and others who were explicitly influenced by Riepel. Another person who was perhaps influenced by Riepel was young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.
There we go.
Father owned one of Riepel's books. And people have talked about Wolfgang Budai and Ulrich Kaiser have written books analyzing Mozart's early works and showing how they relate to specific concepts that Riepel had mentioned. And similarly, Stefan Eckhart has shown how Riepel's concepts could serve as the basis for composition lessons, and that are very much in line with things that young Mozart seemed to frame his compositions along.
So you mentioned that he was a very practical musician. Was his analysis, if you can contrast it with the modern, more of an analysis, more descriptive form of analysis, are there, and I don't want to use the word wrong, but would they say mistakes in his analysis or things that a modern person who is familiar with sonata theory or form analysis would say, why is he using this term or why is he doing it this way?
There's many things that people would say is wrong, and there's a few things to realize. He started writing his books in the 1750s, so he did not know late Mozart's works. So if you're going to compare late Mozart's works to Riepel, you'll find some differences. However,
like what kind of differences? Just for an example.
He did not think in terms of there being specific areas that would embrace a transition section. We tend to think in terms of spaces today, that there's a space that embraces the transition function, or a space that embraces a so-called secondary theme function. Riepel acknowledged you'll have active passages, you'll have lyrical passages, contrasting themes, but they could appear anywhere within the middle of the work, or within the middle of what we today would call the exposition. So if you're looking at works from the late classical period, that is much after Riepel was on the scene, you'd say, well, why isn't it proper to acknowledge that there's an area that encompasses this type of function? But if you look at early music, especially Galant music, you see they were composing more along the lines that Riepel suggested, where these different type of passages could appear anywhere, and it's much more questionable in many cases to try to ascribe just one section or the other as containing the transition or containing what we today would call the secondary theme.
When we speak of the Galant, it cannot help but bring up the Italians, especially from Naples and Bologna and Rome. Do you find that there is a confluence, a parallel with what Riepel is saying and perhaps what the Italians were doing? Did the Italians talk about form?
Not as far as I know. Maybe other scholars can enlighten me on this. I discuss a lot of Italian composers in my book. In my book, I don't merely discuss Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Mozart. I talk about also Michael Haydn and Leopold Mozart and Cimarosa and Jomelli and many composers from Italy. But as far as I know, the Italian composers did not talk about the large-scale form issues that I've mentioned in my book.
I asked why form was so absent in the 18th century. And then suddenly in the 50s, it became more, people were picking up on the topic. What brought about the change? Was it a change in the way people were composing?
Yes. So in the 1750s, in the concept of articulation, that music could be understood to have specific moments of articulation. It became increasingly more prominent as the 18th century went on. This is discussed, for instance, by Stephanie Weil in her book on articulation and punctuation in the 18th century. By about the 1750s, there became, you might say, standard schemas for organizing the punctuations along in the different parts of the movement, especially within the first part of the movement. That is the part that we call the exposition. So the standard pattern of articulations became more regularized, you might say, around 1750, very loosely speaking. And I think the theorists start to pick up on this.
You mentioned the metaphors earlier, and I found that really fascinating. When we're understanding form, is that tied to rhetoric in any way? And did rhetoric or any kind of other external influence affect form in some way?
Yes, absolutely. The rhetoric absolutely affected form, but part of the rhetoric was organizing your thoughts in a certain specific way. And if you could follow the standard journey of the form and the journey and succession, the standard succession of the punctuations in music, that produces a type of momentum. That is, when you hear one resting point, you're expecting the next to follow. And this drives the music on, so to speak.
Now, there were great improvising musicians, as you mentioned, in the 18th century, and everyone had that facility. How did improvisation affect form? Because we have all these partimenti exercises. We have a lot of compositions from that period. When you improvise, do people have these set ideas? Like, for instance, if you do the blues, everybody knows the form, at least the standardized form. Or if you have a jazz standard, everybody knows the form. When people were improvising, were there forms that everyone was aware of?
I believe so. Now, we just like with Partimento, you don't know exactly what happens there, but you have to sort of read between the lines. And you don't have, in Partimento, you're given the bass, so the form is already predetermined, so to speak. But I feel that someone who has skill in Partimento, that is, they can play individual phrases. They know the basic schema for playing individual phrases, and they know a few rules. They can basically improvise a movement in sonata form. The basic rule is, and I'll put it in a nutshell, that each I'll focus on the exposition alone because that's complicated enough. You ultimately start the piece in the home key, and you're going to end the first part, that is the exposition, with a formal cadence that is a perfect authentic cadence that has formal impact. A formal cadence in the secondary key. And then each phrase will have a different resting point than the previous one. So you can't have two main resting points, as they call them, in a row that have the same, except in certain circumstances that were repeated. And each resting point would be a successive resting point would be closer towards the perfect authentic cadence in the new key. Thus, for instance, let's say you start the piece, you start with a phrase that ends with a resting point that's supported by a 1 chord. The next resting point, you can't have it again on a 1 chord. It might be supported by a 5 chord. The next one by a resting point on 5/5, and then finally with a resting point on a cadence in the key of 5. And thus you can see each resting point is different than the previous one, and yet inching closer to the perfect authentic cadence in the new key. Okay. And if you like, I can give an example of this.
Yes, please.
So I hit a resting point on 1. Next phrase, I'm going to hit a resting point on 5. Next phrase, I'll hit a resting point on 5/5. The last phrase, I'll hit a cadence in the key of 5. Now you notice each phrase, you probably noticed the standard schema, such as Robert Yertigan talks about. And each time I organize the phrase in that piece, I use one of the standard schema that I learned from playing Partimenti that someone at the time would have had under their fingers. As far as organizing the phrase, as far as the tonal order, to use Riepel's term, I had that very simple formula. Each phrase ended on a different main resting point, and each time it inched closer towards, and thereby led towards the perfect authentic cadence in the new key. And that was obviously a very simple piece where each phrase was 4 bars long. The phrases could have been stretched out. Each phrase could have had an appendix. Each phrase could have been repeated exactly or echoed, so that, and through such means, this basic scaffold, such as I just played, could be expanded so that you could have multiple phrases leading to a single main resting point.
It was beautiful. And you mentioned a term, resting points. Now, according to your research, is it correct to say that the 18th century conception of form related more to this idea of resting points rather than the formal areas, key centers, or containers you were talking about earlier?
Yes, they did not think in terms of key areas, or at least not, they didn't have that term. They might describe things that we could say, well, that's sort of what we would call a key area. For instance, Georg Vogler was trying to describe one phrase, and he says it starts and ends on the same tone. You'd say, why don't you just say it's in the tonic key area? Because he didn't have that word. This is how he described it. They thought in terms of moving towards resting points. And this is continuous. This is often missed in modern translations, because we like to think in our terms, and we say, well, the theorists back then would talk about moving towards a resting point in the key of 5, and they'd say, well, they're in the dominant key area, but that's our translation. They just talked about moving towards resting points. Just an example, if you would have a resting point leading towards a resting point over the harmony 5 of 5, what they might call Quintabsatz in der Tonart de Quinta. That phrase would be called a Quintabsatz in der Tonart de Quinta, Quintabsatz in 5, whether it started in the tonic key and modulated in its middle, or whether it started in the key of 5 and stayed there the whole time. Today we talk about a phrase that modulates in its middle and a phrase that stays in the key at the same key throughout. We'd give them completely different terms, but they didn't think that. They thought in terms of where you were leading to. And I should also mention that term I use, Quintabsatz, there's no translation to modern English. In my book, I really tried to avoid jargon, but I had to use some German words at times because there's no modern English equivalent, and there's no modern German equivalent for these either. You have a phrase that leads towards a resting point on 5, and the resting point itself is called the Quintabsatz, or a phrase that leads towards a resting point over a 1 chord, and that's supported by a keynote, what we call the tonic triad, and the resting point itself would be called the Grundabsatz. We don't think this way. People today try to translate the word Quintabsatz into half cadence, but it's not accurate. It's a passage that leads towards a resting point. And the analogy I make is if I were to visit you in Singapore, I would take a plane ride, let's say from New York to Paris, and then Paris to Singapore, let's say. So I'd say, well, I have 2 legs. I have the Paris leg and the Singapore leg. Now notice, I might be in the air for 10 hours from Paris to Singapore, but I still call that the Singapore leg.
Right.
Or I might spend 6 hours in the plane from New York to Paris, and I might be in the Paris airport only for 20 minutes, but I call that leg leading to Paris the Paris leg. The whole journey is thought of in terms of the goal point, and that if you can think that way, you can think of what the theorists of the 18th century were thinking about, not in terms of containers, motions to points.
That's brilliant, and that's so interesting. And actually, Poundie, let's also talk about key areas, so to speak, because that's really interesting to me, because I keep hearing in the 18th century, their conception of quote-unquote tonality is a little bit different from ours, and they modulated in very interesting ways. How was their conception of key areas different from the way we think about today?
Well, it was entirely different. Because they didn't have the notion of key areas in the modern sense. They struggled to describe what we call key area. Now, remember, the word area is a metaphor. It's like you have this container that contains this key. It's very helpful when you're talking about 19th century music, where you might start and end a passage in key and might stay there for 3 minutes. But in Galant music, you're moving constantly. So they did not have this notion of key area in any sense in we did. And you'd see, so sometimes you look at the way they're describing it, the form, and you say, why are they talking about it in such an odd way? And maybe they could have had it learned from us, but it's too late. They're already dead. I'm much more interested not in what they could have learned from us, but what we could learn from them. I just said when we a passage that begins and ends in the key of 5, Koch might say that you start with a modulation, a formal modulation to the key of 5. He wouldn't say you begin in the area the key area 5, he said you start with a modulation because the key was ultimately confirmed only when you got to the end of the phrase.
Okay, wow, this is really so interesting. Can I ask you about how this relates to perhaps melody? Now, in the Italian tradition, we know about their hexachordal solfeggio that they did for many years, and I've always suspected that melody in some way informs form. Do we think of form from the melody? Do we think of it from the bass? Do we think of it as big distances to resting points? How do we judge that distance between resting points?
The theorists, such as Koch and Riepel, talked about the form primarily in terms of the melody. But the melody would be supported by a harmony at its resting point. So when I might say just in the summary, we're leading towards a resting point on 1. I really mean the melody leads to a resting point, and it's supported by a harmony that might be a 1 or 5. And I should mention one thing that their attitude really promotes is sort of living in the moment. Whereas we might say you're in, what key area are you in, or what section of the form you are in, they were constantly thinking towards what goal am I moving.
Wow, this is so cool.
I know that you talk a lot about partimenti and improvisation in your show. I think this is very much in line with this notion that you're thinking in the moment. And where am I going to? And it's a different experience. And I find I listen to a lot of Galant music for the first time, just like people back then. I have Spotify. I listen to a Galant piece each time, and I'm just following it. I say, where might we be moving to next? And I'm not constantly thinking, what section am I in, which is often an impossible question to answer unless you study it. Sometimes you could take these pieces and study them for an hour and say, well, I've decided after careful analysis that the transition section begins here. But nobody listens to a play's music like that. They listen to music in real time. And I think by thinking about where you're moving to it's a great way to experience this music as it unfolds. In later music, you're looking at 19th century music to think, I am now in the first theme section, or I am in the transition zone, or I am in the second key area. That becomes much easier because the music is much broader then, and that metaphor becomes very helpful for later music. But in Galant music, it becomes too imposing, I find.
Let's talk about Heinrich Christoph Koch. You write that he was kind of a refining of the ideas of Riepel. Let's talk about him. He represents a good portion of your research. Who was he and his significance? He
was a composer who lived in a provincial town, Rudolstadt, and he was not a great composer, I have to confess. As far as the sample compositions, most people were not great composers. There were a lot of great composers back then, a lot of beautiful music written. But he was trying to explain how to compose music, and he unlike Riepel, he was more staid. He was not such a goofball. He explained things in a more careful manner, but he knew that he wasn't telling everything about music. He was talking about the mechanical rules of music, as he described it. And he emphasized, ultimately, you understand music through feeling. But nevertheless, understanding some mechanical rules can help you as a composer. He was conservative. He was writing for music that he knew during his youth. And this is like many musicians today. If music theorists, if you're talking about the music of the Beatles or John Cage, you're talking about music from a bygone era. And if you're talking, Koch, he was conservative. He was talking mostly about music from, even in 1780, he was talking about music, I think, that flourished during the Galant era, and was trying to organize it and explain in a careful manner for composers. Now, by the time his books came out, musical styles have moved onward, but so they had less of a compositional impact. But as far as understanding the music of the time, I think it's unparalleled. Many people today, when we read his writings, we try to translate him into modern thought. A lot of people give quick lip service. They say, this is what Koch said, but enough about him. Now let's talk about what we want to talk about to begin with. And they miss things that Koch was saying. They will they'll say, he got it wrong. And it's definitely possible that Koch got things wrong. He absolutely did. But it's also possible that we get things wrong. And when you listen and see what Koch was saying and you match it to pieces such as by Joseph Haydn that I discussed earlier, you realize, he's describing exactly what people were doing.
What was the difference between Koch and Riepel?
Well, Koch came years later, so he was more modern and he was more systematic. Partly because he was later time, but also I think because of his personality, he explained things in a clearer manner, much clearer than did Riepel, which has. And just realize that always has its advantages and disadvantages because music's not clear. So he did explain some of these forms in a clearer manner, ones that reflected somewhat later style than did Riepel. But
and
again,
what's later styles? You mean later than the Galant, so like early classical styles?
I'm sorry, Riepel, he started writing in 1750s. So 1760s and 1770s.
Now, was Koch an atypical 18th century theorist in the sense that if you took him, would he be representative of the thought of a Galant theorist, so to speak?
I believe so. I see things like he would say in other writings of the time, reflected by other people, such as Lurline and Vogler and Portman and others. There were some more forward-thinking theorists who caught the avant-garde of the time, you might say, such as Neubauer, someone who's almost never discussed in music history surveys now, or Galeazzi. But I think for the most part, Koch's attitudes were more typical of the time.
I'm very interested to keep going on that point of the differences of the 18th century conception of forms. Now, we talked about the way they talk about key areas and tonality was completely different. Are you able to list the key differences that the way they thought of form?
Yeah, I'd say the differences between what we do and what they do, you might say, is modern theories tend to take cadences as the main signals, main articulation points, and which makes great sense for late classical music and beyond. But that runs roughshod over some of the more subtle articulations that you find in Galant music, where their focus was not on motions towards cadences, but on motions towards resting points, which could take the form of cadences or just could take other forms. We tend to think of sections and as containing various formal functions. They thought, again, more in terms of motions towards goals. We tend to think of certain characteristic features such as transitional passages and lyrical passages as naturally belong to one section or the other. They thought in a much more fluid manner that these types of sections could appear almost anywhere within, let's say, the exposition. And this, again, is reflected in the music of the Galant era.
You do write that Koch actually changed in an earlier stance that he held, for instance, with the labeling of a punctuated 5 chord appearing in mid-exposition as a half cadence. This might have been the result of witnessing a new wave of compositions that employed this technique. Could you mention actually some of these composers or compositions that demonstrated this technique of the punctuated 5th chord?
Yeah, well, the Wolfgang Mozart, as he got older, you can look at music by Wolfgang Mozart still in Koch's concept. And throughout my book, I try to show how you can see that the motions along the punctuation sequence, that is the motion from one resting point to the other, could be expanded to suggest metaphorical zones, or to suggest, or that one of these resting points would be more articulated than the other, so as to suggest what is now known as a medial caesura and things like that. In late Mozart's music, it became increasingly common for one of the resting points on 5 to be much more strongly highlighted than previous ones, and thus could be fairly described as a medial caesura. And the same thing in early Beethoven's music. Around, I think, 1803, Koch, in his lexicon, he suggested something along this type. Now, this was he wrote this at the end, what coincides with around the end of Beethoven's first style period. So it was, you might say, it's about time that he recognized that not all of these resting points were equal, that one of them really stood out. But as I said, he was conservative. So you might say one of the problems, if you're trying to apply Koch's concepts to later styles, one of the problems is that he doesn't always make sufficient distinction between various types of resting points. He'll label as a resting point whether it's a mild resting point or whether it's a huge one. Whereas the problems with modern concepts is that we make too much of a distinction between these resting points, and thus when dealing with galant music, we're too ready to try to struggle to grab one of these resting points out as the medial caesura, when often these resting points are not so strongly differentiated in this earlier type of music.
Okay, I have a two-part question. One is the subject of harmony and form, and the second part of the question is counterpoint and form. How do these topics influence form?
That's a very broad question. I'm not so sure I can answer it. And other people, Koch and Riepel and all the theorists talked a great deal about form. In the large scale, I mentioned how the resting points are shaped by harmonic factors. As far as moving, the details about harmony and the details about counterpoint are very important in moving to each successive resting point, and that involves more internal phrase principles.
What is the trimodular block in sonata theory, and can you elaborate on your commentary of it?
There, in earlier styles, there was no presupposition that there would be just one half cadential break in the middle of an exposition. This is over and over again. You can see this in the music and in the commentaries. That is what we now call an exposition. You'll have the resting points, but it would not necessarily be that one of those resting points would be followed by a half cadential break. You might have none of them. You might have one of them followed by a half cadential break. You might have two of them followed by a half cadential break, but there was no presupposition that there should be one and only one half cadential break, what we would call a medial caesura. So that might be a presupposition you have in later styles, but not in the style of the Galant period. Now, I mention this because when we look at Galant pieces, and let's say there's no medial caesura, we'll say, well, that could be called a continuous exposition in which the medial caesura was suppressed. But notice how we're starting from thinking in a later conception of sonata form. You can think of a continuous exposition as a normal exposition, and a so-called two-part exposition as a normal exposition into which a medial caesura has been inserted. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is, let's say you have a resting point on 5 and a resting point on 5 of 5, each followed by a break. Okay, so you have two medial caesuras. Well, that's one more than modern theory says you're supposed to have under normal circumstances. But it's the exact type of number that you could have according to 18th century theories. In fact, almost every 18th century theorist who talked about form or gave examples of form would give examples as normal expositions in which there was a half cadential break following a 5 and another half cadential break following a 5/5. And it was also reflected in the music of the time, including in one of Little Mozart's first compositions. One of Wolfgang's composition is Kochel 7. He has an exposition which has 2 half cadential breaks. He was not being radical. He was just playing according to the textbooks of the time. But we now are a little flabbergasted. We say, what's going on here? There's 2 half cadential breaks. We're only supposed to have 1 caesura. So we say now, James Hepikowski and Warren Darcy have a very creative way of dealing with this type of situation. And in this, their formulation, that you have the first half cadential break is the true medial caesura that should lead directly to the formal cadence, but instead something happens where there's a surprising second instance of a medial caesura. So the second medial caesura is inserted in a surprising manner, so that you have to have sort of an extra drive towards that perfect authentic cadence. That is, you have the first medial caesura, you enter into this metaphorical secondary theme space, but then you reinvigorate transition motion to lead to a second post-medial caesura, and then you drive towards finally drive successfully towards the formal cadence. It's completely problematic, that view. There's so many different ways and better ways of thinking about that.
Can we talk about Joseph Haydn's Symphony number 14, Movement 1, which you say, I quote, "Even for Haydn, one of the most daringly brilliant composers of the time, this movement stands out for its audacious inventiveness, but you say a lot of its brilliance has kind of been lost on not just the modern audiences, but even really great scholars kind of are not too interested in it. So what is it about that movement that is so amazing?"
Well, there's so many amazing things about Haydn's work, including that one. One of the fascinating things is they have, I'm trying to explain this in a clear manner. Yeah. Among the funny things that happens there is that you have the lyrical passage, what Francesco Galeazzi eventually would call the passo di mezzo, passo caratteristico, comes after the perfect authentic cadence in the exposition. But more radically, in the second half of the movement, you have a possibility is to have the main theme return in the home key, either after perfect authentic cadence in a third key or not. And it seems as though in that movement, the main theme comes rather quickly. And it's what we might call today the recapitulation. But after the apparent recapitulation appears, you have a cadence in the key of 2, which is surprising, and it's just a shocking thing that happens, and it's so surprising if you understand what was normal for the time. But if you say, well, if you try to outline, well, here's the exposition space and here's the development space, it might seem much more normal than it is. And this is an example when you're trying to follow along the lines that people described back then. You can really realize that what he's doing here is a crazy, wacky thing.
You said, my study focuses on a specific style, the Galant style, but in doing so, I hope to suggest ways to approach some of the challenges that musicians may confront in dealing with music of other styles as well. And so could you elaborate on that?
I really picked... I think when I was young, I said, can I have a theory that encompasses all styles of music and everything about all styles of music? The more you try to, the broader range of styles that you try to describe and the broader range of things you try to describe, the weaker your things that you're going to express. The more narrow you try to describe, you're narrowing the style you're talking about, but you'll talk about more intensive things. And this is just one of the problems I find in a lot of modern theory. They'll take concepts by James Epkowski and Warren Darcy, which are very brilliant. They're geared towards the late classical style. And they say, let's take that specific style, and can we see the specific techniques they describe? Can it shed light on music from 1750 through 1900 and beyond? Well, it could, but just you're weakening the power of the concepts, the broader range you're trying to describe. So the thing I might say the biggest takeaway from my book is to understand any style, you have to understand it in reference to its own norms of its own time, and by challenging the metaphors that you use, that every metaphor we use is inevitably imperfect and inevitably blinds us to certain things. Whenever we say, use a metaphor such as a resting point or a second theme zone, we're saying that this is like other things to which we give the same name. We're not talking about scientific, concrete things that exist in an abstract sense. They're metaphors that help us come to grips with a specific style. And in trying to show how you can question standard metaphors and come to grips with a certain style, hopefully that will inspire people to question the metaphors they use in looking at other styles, and also look at the specific stylistic norms for that style, and also consider what people wrote at the time who lived the music, composed it, improvised it, and take those writings seriously, not as just backing up for what we already think, but to reconsider how we view music in such a light. And again, by focusing on a specific style period, I hope to, I don't want people to take the specifics that in the Galant era and apply them to specifics of later era, but to see the method and hopefully use that methodological concept in applying it to other eras.
Great. Well, this has been such an amazing conversation. Can I ask you a couple of fun questions to end off?
Yep.
Okay. Who are your top 3 Galant composers?
Oh boy, that's a fun question. I'd probably say, like everybody else, Wolfgang Mozart and Joseph Haydn, but there's so many great composers of the time. There's Cimarosa and Jomelli and Hassa and Mariana Martinez and Francesca Lebrun. There's a lot of great composers. Sometimes by privileging the greats, we miss that the music's just beautiful, and there's a lot of people who wrote beautiful, inspiring music.
What's the weirdest Galant composition you've ever listened to or analyzed?
Oh, the weirdest one. Boy, that's weirdest one that's bad or weirdest one that's good?
Yeah, either one.
Coleman's piece, the piece by A.C.F. Coleman. This is the worst piece I've ever heard. It's because the Galant era. He's a theorist, and he published a book in 1800, and he cites one of his own pieces as an example. And it's a bad piece. I mean, it would never have survived had he not been around. But one thing I find interesting about this piece is it shows how the average composer probably did compose at the time. Now, I talk about, I think, over 100 composers in my book. There's a lot of great Galant composers, and not just Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Mozart. But for every 100 great composers from the Galant era, there's probably also 100 lousy ones, but who nevertheless wrote in the style and that the people knew at the time.
If you could sit down with any composer or theorist in history, not just Galant, all history, for a conversation, who would it be and what would you talk about?
Well, probably Lynn Rogers, my partner.
Yeah.
Who's also a music theorist.
But you can do that anytime, right?
Otherwise, Heinrich Christoph Koch, almost surely. Though, because I don't speak fluent German, and my German's...
well, let's assume you guys could communicate no problem. Language is not an issue. And what would you talk about?
I'd want him to walk me through some compositions as he understood them. He wrote so brilliantly. I mean, he's so many great thoughts. But I just like the opportunity to sit at his feet. He's so many people. Again, they give lip service to his works and then they move on. He said things that are surprisingly subtle, and I think it's because of his down-to-earth, practical orientation and his acknowledgement that he's not showing everything in music. He's showing the mechanical parts, and there's also an inspirational feeling part that ultimately is what we're all after in music.
Name 3 Galant compositions in your book that you talk about that you think are really interesting.
Well, I end off with 4 pieces. The one is by Hasse, the overture to his Alcide Albivio, where it's an opera about where Hercules he has to choose between going to a path of he has 2 paths, either to a noble path or the path towards enjoyment, and he and the overture itself has different paths along the way that are very creative. I also talk about it in the final chapter, a piece by Mariana Martinez, a brilliant piece. She was a student of Haydn and Hasse, and didn't compose a lot of pieces, but this piece is a remarkable one. And the final piece I'll mention that I talk about in this final chapter is Mozart's quartet for strings, his first movement of Commercial 159. And one fun thing about this is it starts off without the first violin entering, but it's a string quartet. So the first sitting there like an idiot while the rest playing. And then in the middle of the second phrase, the first violin says, like, what's going on, guys? I'm the first violinist. I mean, excuse me? And then enters in, and it's a fun piece. Again, so many subtleties in Galant pieces. It's just one of those real fun moments where if you're getting what's happening, it's a lot of fun.
Well, what a pleasure it's been to have this illuminating conversation with you, Professor Burstein. This is an excellent book, and I do hope my listeners are now interested to go and check it out. The book is Journeys Through Galant Expositions and is available now through Oxford University Press and Amazon as an ebook or as a hardcover, and comes with a companion website which contains scores and links to recordings for almost all the pieces in the book. Before we end, would you like to mention what you have in store for 2021?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Nikhil, for inviting me, and also for hosting this program, which has so many excellent podcasts. I'm sure that your audience enjoys them as I have. My next project, boy, this took so much out of me writing this book that was my first thing. I have other projects along the way, both dealing with Galant music and other styles of music. But hopefully I'll continue with the inspiration that started when I was a young boy listening to John Coltrane and the Bach Gavotte.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Burstein. I hope you had a good time on the show. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.